Most of the municipal restrictions in America that aren't coming out of these homeowners associations or others are just obscenely strict relative to any measure. They are not, forget helping the median home buyer, they're not helping the vast majority of people that are driving up the housing price and even preventing people from unlocking the full value of their house.
Hello. Welcome again to the episode of the Let People Prosper show. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today I'm delighted to bring on another guest who knows a lot about housing, infrastructure, and a lot of other things. And it's none other than Dr. Judge Glock. Judge, welcome to the Let People Prosper show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you on today, Judge, and we've known each other for a while now, so it's good to have you on and kind of talk about these key issues, because I know you write about this often in the Wall Street Journal and other places. So before we get going, though, let me go ahead and give the bio for the audience, so they'll know a little bit more about you as we dive in. So Dr. Judge Glock is Director of Research and a Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor at the City Journal. He was formerly the Senior Director of Policy and Research at the Cicero Institute, a nonpartisan think tank based in Austin, Texas, and a visiting professor of economics at West Virginia University. He writes about the intersection of economics, finance, and housing with a perspective informed by his work in economic history. His work has been featured in National Affairs, Tax Notes, Journal of American History, NPR, the Wall Street Journal, and many others. He is also the author of a book, The Dead Pledge, The Origins of the Mortgage Market and Federal Bailouts, 1913 to 1939. He received his PhD in history with a focus on economic history from Rutgers University. So, with all that, Judge, let me go ahead and ask you the first question that I do with every guest. Why do you do what you do every day?
Well, I guess the first and easiest answer is because I enjoy it. There's few things I would rather be doing with my life than writing, thinking, and talking about economic policy and talking about the future of America. It's a wonderful job, and I'm very grateful that I'm able to do it. And the other reason, of course, is that I would like to think it makes at least some modicum of a difference. We all would like to have some influence on the world, try to move it in a slightly more prosperous direction, as you would say. And, I haven't been as involved directly in government as you have, but I always think those of us with a free market bent should try to think about how we actually can influence real government policy and real actions in the here and now. So an enjoyable and potentially, at least again in some very modern way, influential job, it seems like an ideal position.
Well, it seems like you're doing that too, Judge, in a lot of ways. And I wonder, so how long were you in academia before you decided, you know what, I really want to get into public policy?
I was in academia. I got my PhD over a number of years. I'm not even going to say how many, but I was teaching for just about 3 years, and there was a number of reasons I left. Maybe one reason would be that I wasn't sure I wanted to live another 40 years in Morgantown, West Virginia. As charming as that city is, it's got a lot to be said for it. Another reason is that academia works at a little slower. You may not be able to reach as many people. I like to say that I had my last big academic paper I submitted it right before I went into the think tank world, and it got published about 4 years later, which is not maybe the sort of time frame one would want to get one's ideas out. So it's much more encouraging in a much more fast-paced world to get kind of immediate feedback.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, and it's along the lines of the reason why I did the same thing. I taught at Sam Houston State University for a couple of years, and I enjoyed doing the research. I actually enjoyed teaching a lot. Like, I love the teaching part of it and getting, students to understand what's going on in economics and everything. But to your point, I wanted to make a difference now. and maybe somebody reads these papers along the way. And I still, publish academic papers every once in a while just to keep my foot in that door and everything. But it does take so long to have that sort of influential process. I know Hayek, talked about intellectuals in society where you have this kind of trickle down that happens, but that's a long trickle down, don't you think?
Yeah, it is. And, there's different sorts of research that can be influential in different sorts of ways. And I think One of the things I'm a little better at is kind of aggregating a bunch of ideas. You know, in academia, you're rewarded for very narrow focus on a very series of narrow issues, and you tend to be very specialized in that. And that work is unbelievably important. You need people to do that. One of the reasons I like working for the Manhattan Institute is that historically they're a group that really understands that a lot of great ideas can happen in public forums. You know, unlike academics, influential papers can be popular journalism articles. You know, one of my colleagues was talking about the broken windows theory of policing, which happened to be just an article in The Atlantic back in the early 1980s. And that definitely changed how people worked public policy in terms of policing. And a lot of things happened like that. A lot of great ideas emerged in, say, the Public Interest magazine in the 1960s and 70s. And so I think think tanks can contribute that aspect of the debate that's a little more broad and a little more syncretic in terms of getting different ideas together. And I think that's where my kind of specialty, if I have one, lay.
Yeah, no, I like that a lot. There's so many ways that we can have an influence on people's lives and hopefully help them prosper more. It's so important. So I'm glad that you're doing the work that you do. And, you know, at Cicero Institute in Texas, you did some great work there as well. And so at Manhattan Institute, there being research director and everything, kind of what are your day-to-day, like, big issues that you're really working on?
Well, I work a lot with our economic policy team, and we have a lot of great researchers, Theo Merkel, Brian Riedel, Chris Pope, that do a lot of work on the sort of big spending issues in America. And when I kind of pull back, there are a few issues that seem more urgent to me than America's debt and deficit crisis. I'll have to admit it's not one of my main specialties, like a lot of free market types. I'm very concerned about it. I've written a little bit about it. But the real whizzes that know about the, you know, $5, $6, $7 trillion over a few year programs, I'm really happy to start to help edit their work, get it out there. And otherwise, I write a lot of stuff that I hope can have influence on the areas I care about: reg policy, housing, how regulation is holding back the economy in a lot of different ways. And you try to always balance the potential for impact and for public attention. Sometimes stuff is great for getting a lot of public attention and won't necessarily have the most policy impact, and others will be the reverse. And both those are important in their own way. So try to balance that in my research.
Excellent, excellent. All right, so let's jump into some of this fun stuff now. Let's kind of start with housing and infrastructure and kind of embed it with some of the regulatory issues that were going on. You know, I've talked with several people on the show, with John Taylor, James Brohl, you know, some of the others that have been out there on regulations for many years talking about these things. And, you know, I'll admit, Judge, I didn't give as much favor or what the true cost of regulations are, but they've been opening my eyes to it more, and your work has as well, on the true cost of regulations. Usually we think about it as government spending and taxes and what a burden that is on the economy, but the unseen oftentimes of regulations seems to hit us maybe even more. But I wonder how you like to couch all this together, and given the work that you're doing, I'd love to hear your explanation on it.
Yeah, so the spending is much more visible and clear and calculable than the regulatory burden is. For perspective, pre-pandemic, the federal government was spending not much over $4 trillion a year. You know, a recent estimate from two researchers figured that the federal regulations alone are costing around $3 trillion a year. You add state and local burdens, that could be substantially higher. Now, there's a range of estimates because, again, this is not as easily calculable as the spending side. But I think few people doubt a significant portion of our economy is either held back from its full productivity because of these regulations, or that they are directly causing hundreds of billions of dollars in extra spending a year. So what interests me about that is, one, just the pure size of that, kind of uncovering the burden that is not fully understood and fully comprehended by the general public, and two, seeing how that happens, and seeing, to my mind, one of the most concerning aspects of this, that a lot of it takes place outside of the typical Schoolhouse Rocks model of how a bill should pass and how the government actually creates policy, because it takes place in an executive branch, often with little notice to the public, little awareness, and it can have just massive influences on how we all live our lives. I just wrote a piece for National Review on how on nursing home regulations that the federal government estimates will cost about $40 billion. This is not too different from what the CHIPS Act spent on semiconductors, and that was a much debated, often discussed in the public sphere policy. And this nursing regulation just went kind of sub rosa into completion, and it was done without input from Congress or anybody else, and was basically a giveaway to a small number of nurses unions. But to my mind, that's the really interesting side of it, this kind of quiet burden of the state that we don't see, but can be massively important for how people live their lives. And to my mind, the area that's most important is in housing.
Yeah, definitely. And so speaking of housing, which all of us are spending more time in housing. I actually work from home 100% of the time now, which is nice. And people have been moving a lot, and some are moving from California to Texas, where I live, and Florida and other places. And on some of it, and a lot of it has to do with housing, the high cost of housing and the supply restraints, the increase in demand as people are moving around. There's just so much going on in that market. It's very dynamic in many ways, but there's so much that's also holding it back. And that's where a lot of your work comes in. It's been fantastic. What are kind of your highlights that you like to start with when you think about the housing market?
Well, I've talked to some people, and I've used a line similar to the famous Bob Solow quote about, I believe it was Bob Solow, who said, once you start thinking about growth, it's hard to think about anything else. Like the impacts of economic growth, they're so huge that it just kind of focused the mind almost singularly on that. Once you start thinking about housing, it does tend to sort of focus the mind because of the scale of the issue and how important it is. Now, if you just look at the GDP figures, the gross domestic product figures, housing investment is substantial, but not huge, around, depending on the year, 5% a year, one out of every $20 in the whole economy. If you look at the burden on individuals, though, it's massively larger. So if you look at a household budget in America, almost a third goes to housing costs, which is very substantial. The next most significant part of your average household budget in America is transportation, which is closely related to housing, of course, and that's about 17% of your average or median household budget. So, housing and transportation are just overwhelmingly important for how successful and wealthy your average American is going to be, and you just see unbelievable differences in it. You have median houses in Texas that's not too distinct from $200,000-$300,000 for a substantially sized house, and you can have a single family home in San Francisco where the median price is, at least recently, was significantly above $1 million. So not quite an order of magnitude difference between cities, but close to it. Multiple differences and how costly different housing is. And the answer is, not surprisingly, the extent of regulation in these different cities. A lot of what I work with is to explain not just the size of that burden and how destructive that can be, but also the sort of political economy that creates that burden. So it's nice to have more housing. We all agree on that. I've often, when testifying to state legislators or other about this issue, I've said, I've used another quote that I've often used with my students, which when I was teaching, which was, if I ever wake you up in the middle of class and you didn't pay attention to what I was talking about, and you just want to blurt out something, just blurt out supply and demand. 90% of the time, you'll probably be right. And that's the answer here. These high demand areas that are restricting the supply are driving up the houses. Not that surprising. So from that perspective, to me, it's interesting about the burden of the regulations, but not as sort of curious as, why are these regulations in place? Why do you have so much more regulations in San Francisco Bay Area, Los Angeles, than you do in Houston or even Dallas? You would think these regulations would be either pretty similar across the entire country, or that you would have, that if you had these massive gains that could be gotten from reducing them, the public, the voters, others would push their politicians greater, but they don't, at least in some areas. And that's a very interesting question that I've tried to spend a lot of time answering.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating because there are so many avenues of ways that the government does impede in the supply of housing overall. Well, if you were not necessarily to rank them, but to think about the highest cost of regulation, is it some of the minimum lot sizes? Is it what are some of the key things that really do restrict the supply?
Well, yeah, things like, things I've worked in are things like minimum lot sizes, the inability to grow upwards, to have more substantial housing, apartments, et cetera, especially in the middle of large cities. I've also been an advocate, which has sometimes put me at odds with some of the so-called YIMBY movement, the Yes in My Backyard movement, about the necessity for greenfield growth, about growing outwards. Some of that is due from very large minimum lot sizes, where cities or counties in some parts of America can require, say, 5 acres per house, which is just patently absurd. Nobody needs 5 acres of grass to mow. But the goal here is clearly restrict housing. Some are things like not extending the infrastructure out to certain areas to allow the new developments to happen, basically kind of squeezing growth de facto as opposed to de jure and de jure. And those sort of things can add together to create pretty substantial burdens. Like I mentioned in another kind of measure of housing cost burden is your median income in an area to your median housing price. And in much of the U.S., at least until the post-pandemic run in prices, you had a median house price that was about 3 times your median income, which frankly put U.S. pretty good in terms of international ranking as one of the more affordable housing markets on earth. But you had some areas that were just completely off the charts and looked a lot more like even more heavily regulated markets like London, or parts of Australia, that were like San Francisco Bay Area, parts of California that were 10 times the median income, which is just putting homeownership completely out of reach for almost anybody in the middle class. And that really shows kind of the extent of what these burdens could do. And if you look at parts of, say, the Bay Area, about 40% of the 9-county Bay Area is pasture land. It's just not being used. There's cows grazing on what are property acres that cost not too dissimilar from the acres cost in Manhattan. You know, you have just this cow eating some of the most expensive grass on earth because they refuse to allow people to build anything on that. And one of the reasons I've written about that is that the local government structure in California has created kind of a cartel of local governments that don't see a lot of the upside of growth. And what I've tried to encourage people to do is not just do the mandates from the state and other levels and the local governments allowing those local cities to build up, or forcing the local cities to build up and the local city level allowing developers to grow up and more densely, but also trying to get buy-in from the local cities. How can you make sure that when an apartment complex goes up next to you, you share from some of those local property taxes? You share the gains of growth. Because I think one of the main goals of free market types like ourselves is to show people that growth can bring mutually beneficial gains. And it can. And if it can, then we should find a political coalition that allows that to happen. And part of where I think this has become dysfunctional in California and some other states is that the state has captured a lot of their local property tax dollars. There's not a lot of way for local neighbors to fund their needed infrastructure, and therefore they become inveterate opponents of growth, even if they themselves could benefit a lot from developing their land more densely. And that's a real problem that doesn't look like it's going to be solved anytime soon, at least in the California and some of the West Coast states where the burden is really far ahead of most of the United States.
Yeah, that's rough. And I think, thinking through some of those things, with housing in general, what it seems to be, and we're getting a lot of this in Texas because the housing prices soared since the pandemic and everything, especially in places near Austin where I live. And you've seen this cost go up quite extensively, as you know. Places like Houston, it didn't go up as much. It did go up quite a bit, but they have less zoning than places like Austin. Even in Texas, you can see the dichotomy between those two. But some things that's coming up that I'd love to give your reaction on is there's this discussion now about how investors are purchasing so much of the property, and that's restricting the supply. And some are saying we need to do something about it. In fact, Governor Greg Abbott had a tweet about this not too long ago, saying, "What's going on here? We need to attack this or do something about it next session." And so I wanted to get your thoughts on that, but also kind of this not in my backyard, the NIMBY movement, not the YIMBY, but the NIMBY movement. Even some of my more conservative friends are like, "Look, I don't want more people to be coming in. I don't want to have smaller lot sizes because it's already too compact now." And so I want to get your thoughts on some of these things, Judge.
Yeah, so the investor purchase housing issue is, of course, a red herring and very much an unhelpful one. One of the reasons, in fact, housing is so expensive in general is that you've actually not seen a lot of nationalization of the industry, that landlords, unlike a lot of other industries, are often single families that purchase a house down a lot. And God bless them for doing that. It requires a lot of supervision and a lot of work, and we need people to provide that rental housing. But obviously, one of the reasons that a lot of America is so prosperous is because you have national companies that can bring their knowledge about service, about finance, about all of these other benefits that go underneath their corporate brand into these local housing markets and bring those benefits there. The same way we need more nationalization of, say, the building trades and building industry and a lot of these other construction firms, which are very localized and haven't seen a lot of productivity growth over the past few decades. So that's a positive thing, and the move to restrict these institutional purchases of housing is just a completely misguided one, but not surprising. This is similar to what you see is when you see inflation in any part of the economy. You see a lot of people blaming the companies, and the housing price inflation is no different. And so you see the blame fall on the companies as opposed to the regulatory burden that's creating those high prices. So
and real quick, Judge, before we move on to the NIMBY stuff. Something that I've seen here recently has been, I think it was the Wall Street Journal article, showed that investors are about, maybe 25% of the market in housing. Now, it could be larger in certain areas. I know some have said it's like 45%, which I don't know where they're getting this number. Maybe that's a very small part of the market where investors are coming into. But it seems like, to your point, so in general, it's a smaller share of the market. It's not really that much greater than before the pandemic, at least from the Wall Street Journal article. I think it was 20% then. Now it's 25%. So it's higher, but it's not a huge amount. But it seems to me like in a marketplace like this, that you're having it also, not only, I like your point there too, where you have more institutional knowledge of what's coming in to provide better services, and it's mutually beneficial exchanges that are taking place. But it also seems to me like it added more liquidity into those markets if those investors are coming in, because remember, during the COVID and lockdowns, people couldn't really move around as much. So if you wanted to sell, it was very difficult to do so because of the market, the lockdowns and everything else that was going on. You didn't have as much demand. And so this allowed for more demand to be in the market to where some people could sell that otherwise couldn't. So it was helping in many situations. And so I think if we remove that or hinder it with some sort of legislation, couldn't we also reduce some of the liquidity and allow for this market to not be as fluid as otherwise? Yeah,
it's a real tragedy in that the housing market, of course, always requires both a buyer and a seller. And although some people may be concerned about this increased demand driving up housing prices, of course, that benefits someone who's trying to sell from them, maybe move into a better house. And obviously, in the long run, if you had a normal cost curve without regulatory burden, increased demand would just lead to the increased production of new units, and the actual price would not vary. But the restrictions in supply are what causing those local increases in prices due to the increased demand. But in a sense, their demand for housing, or specifically rental housing, can only go to the point where people are willing to pay that much in rent. Like, they can't create the demand for more housing, which is ultimately from the consumer, not from the investor side of it. They can't have influence. And if you look outside of, it depends on, yes, what measure of the market you use to say institutional purchasers have X amount. But if you look at the entire housing market, which of course 60% of plus of all homes in America are homeowner owned. They have the and then it's only about 30% that are rental, and then you have closer to maybe 1 or 2% of the entire housing market being held by these institutional investors. So yeah, this is a very minimal issue that's really, if anything, is it's surprising it's not happened earlier. The unfortunate aspect that it's happened at a time of very rapidly rising housing prices, partially because of the Federal Reserve policy that is creating these higher interest rates, and those higher interest rates are downstream with the higher inflation. But that's just something that hopefully in the long run we should have a housing market that has more of this institutional backing from it, as opposed to just local landlords and others that are renting out. So yeah, on the NIMBY issue, as I have tried to talk to some of my more completely libertarian friends about this, about banning any sort of local restrictions on housing, there does seem to be a libertarian case for some amount of control over your neighbor's property. At least we know this is true because of homeowners associations. People can, with 100% unanimous agreement, so this is not, a public policy being forced on a recalcitrant minority. This is people freely entering into a contract to be a member of a homeowners association or condominium or a co-op association. If you look at it, I believe it's the majority of new housing in America is part of some of this what's called kind of community property association. So there is a demand for this. There is a demand for people to be part of a community where they have some amount of control of their own property. Now, and we should allow people to satisfy that demand, ideally by writing these sorts of contracts that help it, by allowing them to write these sorts of contracts that allow them to create community property associations. Now, the other side of this, though, is that most of the municipal restrictions in America that aren't coming out of these homeowners associations or others are just obscenely strict relative to any measure. They are not, forget helping the median home buyer, they're not helping the vast majority of people that are driving up the housing price and even preventing people from unlocking the full value of their house. If someone is prevented from selling their lot and their house to build something that's maybe 3 times as dense, they are losing a lot of value themselves from their ability to do that. That is hurting a lot of homeowners. And when some economists look at what they call the zoning tax, that's precisely how they measure how much value is lost to homeowners because of their inability to fully develop their own land. And again, if you look at San Francisco, you see in the range of, say, $400,000 per extra quarter lot that is just being wasted, or quarter acre that is just being wasted due to these excessive lot size restrictions. So I understand people who want some amount of zoning control. I wrote a piece called 2 Cheers for Zoning that they say there's some amount that should be allowed because it's meeting this demand for people to have some amount of control over their household. But the current structure now is just unbelievably destructive. And I think for people that do consider themselves part of the YIMBY movement like myself, we need to have answers to those sorts of questions and not tell people, hey, everywhere and at all times, there won't be any sort of restrictions on any building at any time. That's not a winning argument in America. What we can say is, hey, look, here's a way to increase your own value in the house and bring prices down. I mean, a way to think about housing is it's a joint good, right? It's a tied good. There's the lot and the house on it. If you allow increased development, you can increase the value of that lot because you can build more on it. At the same time, you're reducing overall housing prices because you're allowing the more production on that at the same time. So you can ideally create a win-win situation where everyone who owns that lot can sell it for more, but the actual price of the houses on that lot is going down because they're more available everywhere. And that should be the main goal of those of us who are trying to create a more free market in housing.
Yeah. Fascinating stuff. I think one of the things that I've kind of seen, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, Judge, is, there also seems to be some populism going on with this, is that they're wanting to find any answer that they can without looking at the root cause that's usually government being the problem. To your point about the regulations and the zoning and other things, is that the government is creating these higher value prices and everything else that's going on and making an unaffordability crisis in many places for housing. Whereas when they see the shiny object of investors coming in and maybe increasing in certain areas the purchases and everything else, and they see the home prices going up, that they want to jump onto that and say we need more government to come after that instead of going after the root problem, and we've seen this in a lot of other areas. But how could, and there's a lot of legislators and influencers who listen to the show and watch the show. Where are some of the best places to start? Right. Let's say in Texas they really come down to this, and I think there's going to be some hearings. I know there's going to be hearings about these institutional investors and what influence that has and everything else. I think there will also be some about minimum lot sizes. There were last year as well. But where are some of the places that they really should start? Because there's also this discussion, of course, Judge, about the state versus local governments. How much should the state be telling the local governments what to do about their zoning restrictions and things of that nature?
Yeah, it's a difficult question, and I understand a lot of the reluctance on some legislators to do something about it. Although I will say over the past 3 or 4 years, you've seen an incredible number of state laws passed in everywhere from Arizona to Texas itself to Montana famously that are forcing these local governments to open up to some extent a little more. And that's going to be crucial for reducing the housing cost burden. But to take maybe just one slight step back to look at the overall structure of the American housing system, if we can call it that, you have this absurd system where at the local level, the main job of local governments is to restrict housing supply. And at the federal level, their main job is to increase housing demand through subsidies through the Federal Housing Administration, through Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. And so you have a perfect storm of restricted supply at the local level, and the federal government's inevitable solution, time again, is well, we need to increase demand, which the end result, of course, is almost pari passu, dollar for dollar, to drive up the price of housing more. And you saw this with Biden had a recent sort of clear campaign bait proposal to increase tax credits for first-time home buyers by $10,000, for sellers by another $10,000, and then add in some few more subsidies there. My bet would be the actual value of homes would increase by the discounted value of $10,000 or $20,000 plus dollars almost immediately upon passage of such an act. So it will do nothing whatsoever to increase housing affordability. So what some of the states can do, they can do some of these preemption laws. I've advocated that a lot of these cases, they should focus on the big cities themselves. One, because the suburbs are much more reluctant to be opened up. Because people do have the kind of this demand for some amount of suburban living over there. And two, because you can think of big cities as sort of local monopolies in a sense. If you think of a number of different cities as sort of competing, like ideally we would want government to compete, it helps to have a lot of different cities. There's plenty of evidence from school districts to the cost of local government that the more competing governments you have, the more efficiently they operate. The cost of government goes down. The efficiency of it goes up. The quality of government goes up. You've seen research like Carolyn Hawksby show if you have more school districts in an area, that's going to improve competition. Now, like you, I think there should be a lot more just vouchers to allow people to go around. But there's a lot of things that we're going to have local government always do. And to my mind, we should want government to happen a lot at the local level. Now, if you look at these big cities, though, it's a different beast entirely. These big cities, I think I wrote recently that about 30 cities in America are bigger than our smallest state, Wyoming. So These are not tiny places that are just operating in some large state. In some places, you have the major city or metropolitan area be the majority or close to the majority of the entire state's population. So restricting those big cities' ability to restrict housing through minimum lot size reform, through increased development, especially along commercial corridors, it can be very productive. Another thing that I hope more states take advantage of, and that both Texas and Florida have done recently, is reducing building codes for areas that don't have a lot of zoning restrictions, such as Houston, which famously is the one major city that doesn't have any zoning. The main regulatory burden is these zoning codes, or the ability to get zoning permits. And Texas and Florida recently allowed people to go to a third-party permitter to get all your stamps on your innumerable number of documents you need to build something in America, and that can hopefully speed that along. And frankly, doesn't even directly impinge on local control, because you're just saying, hey, you can pass the laws you want, but make sure you don't have to go to a government official to say, Mother, may I, to approve these documents. If that something is done by the letter of the law, let it happen on its own and have third-party contractors compete for it. So there's a lot of things like that state legislators can do to help reduce these housing prices.
Yeah, love it. Good ideas there, as always, Judge. As we're thinking about some other issues that are kind of related to this, though, you had a good piece out recently in the Wall Street Journal talking about local debt in Chicago. But I wonder if there's some connection there, for one thing, but also, like, what's going on with some of these cities? I mean, we've heard about Detroit, you're right. They had problems for a long time. And I think a lot of these larger cities like Chicago and Detroit are seeing population declines, which of course means your revenue base is also leaving. And if you don't get your budget under control, you're going to have more debt and other problems come up. But what are some of your other research that you've been looking at here? What does it really show?
Yeah, so it's a dangerous time for central cities, which of course, are usually the main economic driver of whatever metropolitan area they're a part of. But you can think of city as a metropolitan city is to some extent sitting on a gold mine. Famously, if you have a sort of resource curse, if you have an area that just gets free money from sitting on a gold mine, an oil well, whatever, you have a tendency for the government to expropriate a lot of that excess revenue, or rents as economists would call them. And to some extent, you can see central cities as being in a position similar to that insofar as their central business districts, their CBDs, are throwing off an incredible amount of revenue, sometimes, a third or plus of local property taxes, which are the main funding source for many local governments. And the city has to provide very little resource to that. If you have an office building, you don't have to educate the kids that live there. You don't have to provide social services to it. Basically, you have to provide a road and some police, and most office workers are not needing the most heavily policed sort of work to make sure they can just get in and out of the building and go back to their house. So these central cities had these kind of free money that was flowing off forever, and there was no likelihood that was going to run somewhere else. One of the fundamental truths about cities is that they're sticky. The downtown of these cities is there because they're the center of a circle and they're the closest to everything else. So there's no way that the downtown is going to suddenly jump from Chicago to Evanston or wherever it is. That downtown is going to be in Chicago. Now, the problem, which I wrote about in Chicago and elsewhere, is that you suddenly see an explosion of work for home. So these central business districts do not have this incredible resource that's going to be throwing off free money indefinitely now. In Chicago, you see the downtown vacancy rate in these office buildings at 25%. Over the long run, recently, I believe it was the Tax Policy Center, put out a report that these decreased commercial property tax are going to reduce these city budgets by a few percentage points a year over the next time, which for a city that's on the margin, it's already was taking on excess debt like Chicago, this can be devastating. Instead of having a continually growing downtown office block, you're going to have a continuously shrinking one. And that debt burden, like I put on Chicago, but also true in New York and a lot of the other big cities, is going to be more unbearable. You have places like Chicago that have all of the kind of four horsemen of the apocalypse: decreasing population, decreasing economic growth, increasing taxes, and increasing debt. Now, over the long run, that's not a sustainable solution. And a lot of these urban areas that have been surviving due to this kind of free cash flow from their CBDs, they're going to have to change course immediately. And the pandemic is going to make them, and the after effects of that in terms of work from home, are going to force them to do that very soon.
Wow. And did some of this also have an influence from all the federal funds?
Yeah, so as part of the American Rescue Plan, Biden administration distributed funds to these local cities and states on a formula that's pretty absurd, that actually involves partially at least, the amount of older housing stock in the cities. So this was explicitly kind of designed, actually, when the first use of this formula was created in the 70s, to favor older cities, largely in the Northeast, frankly, more Democratic cities. That's the purpose. Some of these cities got multi-billion-dollar bailouts from the pandemic, and then that allowed them to keep the wolf from the door for at least a few more years. But over the long run, what's been called tin cup urbanism, constantly begging for help from higher levels of government, which was very common from the 1970s through the 1990s, that's not going to last. What we saw in that period, that earlier period of tin cup urbanism, is that most people do not want to pay to bail out profligate cities that haven't been keeping within their resources that are already home to some of the richest people in the world. And so these cities are, while they got a bailout from the pandemic in the short term, as I said before, in the long term, it's all of these after effects are going to cost them.
Wow. And with these local governments, what are some of the best ways for them to overcome these obstacles? I mean, one would be limit spending or cut spending, but what are some other ways that they could really look to? I mean, maybe it's growth, right? I think growth maybe is part of that, but what do you think about what they should be doing instead?
Yeah, I mean, it's not too surprising. Limiting the spending is the first, last, and foremost issue they have to face if they're going to be successful again. I mean, the second sort of easy answer or sort of simple sort of solution is to push back against municipal unions. Now, the private sector unionization rate has been going down in America basically since the mid-1950s. We used to have about a third of the whole workforce in unions, and now in the private sector, that's about 6%. But almost in complete reverse move, while we had basically no public sector unions in the 1940s and 50s, now we have about a third of all public sector workers are part of a union, and they have a lot of control through their collective bargaining agreements on how much they get paid, how much or how little they can work. A lot of them have negotiated what's called release time or official time that allows them to actually stay on the city payroll but spend all of their time as union activists, which is pretty amazing. So we're all paying a lot of money to someone. Some of them are doctors, some of them are police officers. I heard a story recently about a police officer who has been spent so long being an official union lobbyist while still being paid by the government that he couldn't practice policing again when they removed him from that position. He had to go back to police academy. Like, this is an absurd, easy thing. And if we can take on a lot of these unions, because especially at the local level, the number one expense is personnel. The federal level, number one expense is all these transfer programs, your Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. At the local, some of those transfer programs flow down to the state and local level, where the end result is employing a lot of people. The vast majority of people who work for the government in America work for state and local governments. And getting that workforce more limited, making them actually work efficiently, making sure they don't spend their time as taxpayer-funded union advocates seems like an easy answer for a lot of these cities.
Yeah, no, those are great ways to go about that there. Judge, as we're finishing up here, there's a lot of things to get upset about and have some pessimism, as Americans and where we live and everything else. But what makes you optimistic about the future? If you are, what makes you optimistic about the future?
Well, I appreciate you asked that, because I feel one of my continual hobby horses that I'm riding, both among liberals and conservatives even these days, is why one should be bullish about America. And to me, the case just seems overwhelming. Not only are we by far the richest society in the history of humanity, many of these facts, but, the GDP per capita of Britain is about the same as West Virginia in America, which is either our poorest or second poorest state in America. By many measures, we have an average income about 30% higher than a lot of the other so-called developed countries in Western Europe. We're one of the few countries that is growing still in the developed world, that is growing very rapidly, thanks partially to immigration and thankfully to, although reduced, is still relatively higher birth rate than a lot of other places. America, and just, I think you look at the history of America, and for all of the problems we have now, they just pale in comparison to things we've faced throughout our history, and that we've overcome, frankly, with a lot of effort. In some ways, we've achieved a lot of the success we want to achieve, and despite all these burdens, the old Adam Smith line about there being much ruin in any nation, if contemporary America in 2024 is probably the place where you would most want to live your life at any time in any country in human history, that's a pretty good spot to be in. And even the pessimists that I talk to, they're, I liked America 10 years ago before some craziness happened. Or, if you're the liberal side, it's like, well, I like Europe right now or something. But even they wouldn't go back 20 years. So for even to my mind, the extreme pessimists are like, America in 2024 is still in my top 10 countries of all time and all places. And
Yeah.
that's pretty good. You know, this to me, it's still number one all time, all places. And my firm belief is that America will continue being the most successful, dynamic country on earth for the foreseeable future.
Amen. Especially with people like you working on it and improving ways to go about it, Judge. For the audience, where would be the best places to find you?
Well, I'm not a big Twitter guy, although I'm trying to be more on it. You can just look at Judge Glock at Twitter. But for kind of a full list of all of my recent publishing over the past few years, you can look at Manhattan Institute, just the webpage, and you can see some of my work there.
Yeah. Awesome. And I'll be sure to put that in the show notes and everything. Judge, thank you for being on the show, and God bless you and your family.
Same to you, Vance. Thanks so much. Very much enjoy the show, and glad I could be on it.
Hey, awesome. Thanks so much. Well, for the audience, like I told you, I mean, Judge is a pleasure to talk to, and he's a gift for all of us because he's doing so much great work. First of all, God bless you as listening to this, and thank you for listening. Remember, you can find all the show notes at vanceginn.substack.com or vanceginn.com. And until next time, let people prosper.